All right, Rebecca, we might start with you. Now, you are currently working for Yumba, and you're also a PhD candidate, which is really impressive. Your work is going to really help to inform generations of the outcomes of your research. Can you tell us a little bit about your PhD and why you've chosen that topic?
Sure. So I'm completing my PhD through the National Industry PhD scheme. So the whole aim of this scheme is to provide employees that are already working in industry, and particularly in a role that's related to research, an opportunity to also complete their PhD while staying embedded in industry. So it's all around, I guess, increasing that industry translation of your research, which is really exciting. So my project is based around abalone diets and developing abalone diets that increase survival, with a particular focus on increasing survival during periods of production that are really challenging, so especially over summer. And so to provide a bit of context, I guess, as to why I'm so passionate about this project. So I grew up on the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia. So as a consequence of that, I was surrounded by seafood and surrounded by aquaculture. And I also grew up on an agricultural farm. And I'm actually about to marry into another agriculture farming family. So I've just always been embedded within primary industries. And because of that, I just have such a deep respect and appreciation for those industries and the people that work within those industries. They're some of the most hardworking, down to earth, and oftentimes the most innovative people. So I just knew that, I guess, whatever career path I went down, I wanted it to be something that helped ensure a prosperous future or a sustainable development of those industries. So I guess going back to my project, with seawaters predicted to continue to increase, I think developing diets that improve survival in those conditions is really vital, and increasing water temperatures are going to continue to pose a real threat to Australian abalone farms. So I guess this project not only provides me the opportunity to work on research that's really, really interesting, but also something that I have a deep sort of personal connection with as well. So yeah, it really was a perfect fit.
Great. I can't wait to hear the outcomes of your research. I am a very big ocean nerd, so I love reading weird papers, and it's great. Kiarne, we'll come to you. So our whole panel, I should have mentioned this, but it is up here, we're talking about educating future generations through this space. And so, Kiarne, how can businesses effectively educate and communicate their sustainability initiatives without falling into that trap of greenwashing?
It's a big question. I'm a little bit greenwashed myself today. The reality of greenwashing is that it's not necessarily what everybody calls it. It's not necessarily just people that are lying or overstating the truth. Greenwashing is the gap between what is fact and what the person believes is fact. And it's as simple as that. It could be absolutely factual, but like Rebecca said, if people don't understand the research, for example, if you're giving them information that they don't understand, if it's too technical, that could also be considered greenwashing. Most importantly, there's probably 3 key things when it comes to avoiding greenwashing. You need to know if your sustainability claims are a feature, a benefit, or the purpose of your product. If it's a feature, treat it like it's a feature. If it's a benefit, maybe it gets a little bit more, coverage. If it is the purpose of your product or your business, that's when you can shout it from the rooftops. Context is critical.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think a lot of people kind of retrofit the sustainability effort to what they're doing, and it isn't necessarily the value of their business, right?
Indeed. Yeah. And that's where you need to know where it belongs, whether it's on a billboard or when it's on the back of a pack. All of that is really relevant to avoiding greenwashing.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. Nina, now, hello. Chef extraordinaire here. Nina is an ambassador with the AC, and so in Australia, and also Vietnamese background. So, Nina, in Australia, there has been a stigma around imported seafood, especially that from Vietnam. Yes. And as an ASC ambassador and amazing chef, you are highlighting Vietnamese culture to bridge that discomfort that people might have with imported seafood. How are you doing that?
So this year I've started a new initiative called Fur and Femme, where I basically combine the deep stories of my cultural heritage, which is Vietnamese, and I love to tell the stories of the dishes, but also where they're from. And a part of that storytelling piece and the actual events is that it's an educational experience where people get to have, well, hopefully it's a delicious educational experience where people get to actually learn about the traditional dishes, but also where they're sourced and how it's, it can have a really positive impact on the Vietnamese communities, the Vietnamese fishing communities that are actually producing and a part of the process. So, yeah.
And are you having good feedback from this? Or have you started yet?
I have started. Yeah. I've had great feedback. We've actually got one coming up this weekend where we're doing a Vietnamese yum cha, and we're doing things like prawn and basa dumplings with, like a ganjuot. So it's like a tom yum type broth, and it's all yum cha. It's all geared towards, International Women's Day weekend, and just telling the stories of incredible Vietnamese women and just where the seafood is sustainably sourced. And I think it's really important to basically shed light on what is actually sustainable and what isn't sustainable. So similar to what you were speaking about. So I think it's really, really good just to have that education piece to change the misconceptions that people do have about, where the seafood is, where they're sourced. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess on that note as well, there's a lot of different species that you use in Vietnamese culture that may not be used here by Western Australians. So it's a great way to highlight those other species that we should be using and eating. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I was speaking to Duncan earlier. Where is Duncan sitting? And I was having a wonderful chat with Duncan about, the different types of seafoods and even Australian salmon and the different flavours that different cultural cuisines would be looking for. And so, we should be kind of getting behind it and just learning more about it.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Nina. Matt, let's move on to you. So you work at the Australian Maritime Museum. What outreach initiatives or exhibits does the museum offer to foster that deeper understanding of ocean health and the importance of sustainable seafood?
In some ways, I've got a relatively...
I might need to flick your microphone up. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, is that better? Sorry. Look, in some ways we've got a relatively easy job because there's so many amazing knowledges about First Nations' relationship to the sea that are all around Australia's coastline. I mean, even in Sydney here, if you go to Guringai National Park, just across the water over there's thousands of rock engravings, and more than 50% of those rock engravings are of marine creatures. People have been preserving their knowledges of the sea, living sustainably with the sea, mosaic farming by, seasonally going to different areas, not over-harvesting in different places, moving to other places. There's a really beautiful way that the Aboriginal knowledges of the sea was preserved without the textbooks and science which we use today. And so we work with all sorts of communities, and there's a great way that we're piecing together these connections between many coastal communities as well. And you see fragments of one story being connecting other communities further up. I mean, in the Tasmanian communities, which we were most recently working with, there was some amazing research about how the kelp water carriers that they used to use are also a source of iodine for people in the community, especially for pregnant women. There's these ways that the sea and the harvesting of marine resources is part of everyday life that's just incredibly special. Not to mention when you go up to Yolngu country, I mean, half the people in the communities up there, their surnames are names for the sea. They're the names for clouds coming over the horizon, or the way that the sunlight reflects on the water. Even the deepest creation stories of many ocean coastal communities are stories of the sea, and people coming from the sea and visitors, and these really beautiful stories about the formation of islands and different stuff, which are actually deeper stories about kinship and stories about people connecting and preserving their knowledge sustainably into the future. So it's a daunting job trying to collate and to work with artists and community knowledge holders, but we also find seafood is a really great way to bring together. You can hold a boring consultation session, or you can put on a seafood barbecue. You're going to get a lot better turnout and a lot better conversation as well.
A lot better way to get people in, isn't it? Great, thank you, Matt. Actually, we might come back to you, Matt, while we've got time. So you are working in partnership with the ASC to highlight Indigenous story and also Indigenous science, because it is our oldest living culture and our oldest living science when it comes to sea country. What are some of the partnerships you have with the ASC through the museum?
The last one last year, which was incredibly successful, was with Nornie Barrow, the Torres Strait Islander chef. Not surprising, seafood is a pretty big component of the Torres Strait Islander diet, and it was a no-brainer really to sort of bring together some of her family recipes, but also give it a real contemporary twist to really connect with modern commercial audiences. And when you look around different parts of the country, the amazing work that's being done with the communities in South Australia and their pipi industries. We do a lot of deep research with Narooma, for example, which has, it's a natural site where abalone are increasing. The people use the abalone shell as fish hooks. They use, what is quite expensive in a restaurant in Sydney. That's their bread and it's their everyday food sometimes. It's really special to see the way that marine resources can sustain communities. I think because the other amazing project we did was about restoring oyster reef habitats. New South Wales has less than 10% of its original oyster reef habitats. But, reinserting them, it cleans the water. There's so many tangible benefits other than just the food as a resource. They're the bones of rivers. They stop coastal erosion. The more that we sort of look at the pre-contact world and try and work with First Nations knowledge holders to find sustainable ways to bring that, spaces of abundance back, I think there's a massive flow off to tourism, to education, and just, general society well-being.
Great. Yeah, I love that you're able to partner with places like the ASC and the MSC to really showcase this knowledge and spread it wider to a wider community through the museum. It's really powerful. Thanks, Matt. Rebecca, let's go over to you. We're talking about science communication, and you really do have a passion for science communication. So why do you think it's so important?
I think science communication, it's critical. Science is how we, it's how we innovate, it's how we grow, it's how we develop. And you can only get that development if you're taking your results from the lab and getting them to the people that have boots on the ground. And this is something that Australia actually has typically pretty poor research translation compared to other developing countries. And this is in no way a reflection of the calibre or the volume of research and science that Australia is doing. It's more about us needing to improve or bridge the gap between, the lab and I guess the real world. And I think we are definitely moving in a better direction. The government's bringing out initiatives like the National Industry PhD program, and they're continuously starting to encourage HDR and continued education embedded within industry. And, universities are starting to follow with their own independent programs as well. So I think we are really heading in a better direction in terms of increasing our research translation, but I think there's always more work that we can do as well in that space.
Yeah, and for businesses as well, having a PhD candidate is actually researching on the ground what they're implementing, commercialising. It's a perfect win-win.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space to work in because you've got to balance the needs of academia and then the needs of industry, which are often go head-to-head at times. So it's a really interesting, having to navigate both academic supervisors and industry supervisors. But I think that is the way that we need to go with our HDR in the future.
Yeah, especially if we want to educate those future generations. Yeah, thanks. Kiarne, what role do future generations of consumers play in driving sustainable consumption today?
Well, I think the first thing is that they're already doing it, even if they're not the consumer or the person that's paying. If you talk to anybody in the room that's got a child between the age of 5 and 17, 85% of them are instructing their parents or giving their parents guilt trips to buy or don't buy something. So they're already influencing a lot of that. But the reality of sustainable consumption is it's an issue of supply and demand. It's like anything, it's a supply and demand thing. It's driven by consumer demand that is lacking at the moment because of cost of living crises, lack of knowledge, education, etc. But if businesses can recognise that in about 4 or 5 years, the average consumer is the same person that was striking from school with Greta not so long ago, then they realise that they need to plan for that demand now
Yeah.
and be ready to supply it.
Yeah.
So they have a big role to play.
Yeah, definitely. That is a really good point that, these kids have grown up with these values embedded in them already, and they are the next big lot of consumers and voters. So we need to cater for them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We'll finish off, Nina, with you, because we'll jump to the next panel in a second. But what are some of the challenges that you face in promoting sustainable aquaculture, both within a restaurant setting or with the wider community?
I think in the hospitality industry, especially when you're trying to push for a change, when it involves a whole industry, I think it's really important to continue the education, because the more we talk about it, the more we educate people, the more it will become a norm. And it's not going to be easy. Like, change takes time, but it takes everyone being on the same page that we want to be sustainably sourced. That's a really, really important thing. And for people to also understand exactly what sustainability is, because sustainability can also mean the impact that we have on the local communities that are actually in there. If you look at the Vietnamese communities that are part of these farming towns, you can see this huge change economically. The kids are going to school, they're riding their bikes, people are in employment. And I think that slowly shifting, I want all the other chefs to also think, we buy our chef's jackets from a specific place. You think about brands like Patagonia. I want people to consciously think, when they're making a conscious choice about the seafood or any produce that they're consuming, to associate it like that. I am making a great choice, things like that.
Great. Thank you, Nina. Well, can we thank all of our panellists? And thank you, everyone. And I think we've, kind of wrapping up this panel, it really does show that talking about sustainability within your business, educating your consumers is really important, and it's really important for the future generations as well, so that they do know what your product is about, why it's sustainable, why they should be choosing it. Taking them on that journey is a really important thing, and using partners and everyone else in the community to tell your story too. Thank you. All right, now, you guys can get on down. Had enough of you. We will have an MSc panel. So I'd like to welcome Anne, Darian, Kiarne, you can stay, sorry, get back up here, Melanie and Heidi to the stage. Thank you.
So thank you for being here. I'm Anne Gabriel, the Program Director of the Marine Stewardship Council, and it's a pleasure to meet all of you. I'm going to kind of hand it over to you to introduce yourselves. Tell us how you'd like us to see you, and what keeps you excited about sustainability.
Okay, no small task there. Hi everyone.
Right into it.
Lovely to be here. My name is Darian McBain and I work in sustainable supply chains primarily. So I have a PhD in supply chain management. I came to work in the seafood industry because I worked for Thai Union, one of the largest seafood processors in the world, and led their sustainability efforts. I then worked in finance, I worked in different commodities, and I also dabble a little bit in academia. And so for that work, the work particularly with Thai Union, I was named a UN SDG Pioneer for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, and I always try to think about what do we need to do to make the oceans more sustainable, our interactions with the oceans more sustainable. And I heard from one of the previous panelists, the formative years, how they grew up. And I think I spent my Christmas holidays in Stradbroke Island off Queensland. You can't help but connect with the oceans when you have one of those sort of formative experiences. So that stayed with me forever. And today I'm here specifically because I'm on the board of trustees for the Marine Stewardship Council. So thank you for having me, Anne.
Pleasure is all ours. Kiarne. Well, firstly, thank you for having me here twice. I don't come from a seafood background. I'm a marketer and comms specialist by trade. I founded a platform called Sustainability Tracker to do what we're all trying to do in this room, which is to take the science and put it into the hands of the consumer at the point of purchase so they understand what they're buying. And I'm here because one of the big things that we're trying to do is to help people to understand ecolabels, what they mean, when to use them, and when to believe them. I do this, and I'm here because marketing and communications plays an enormous role in education, and it plays an enormous role in translation of the science and creating a usable, tangible piece of information for a consumer to shop with. And because if we keep doing that, if we just keep talking, eventually we'll start to see some traction. And so I will continue to spread the word as much as I can.
Hi, I'm Melanie Robertson. I'm the CEO of the Forest Stewardship Council. So they just had to weave forests into the day somehow. Why am I here? And why do I do the work that I do? And it's essentially, it distills down to, how do we actually have our forests or our marine environment and those incredible resources that we have both in Australia and New Zealand and throughout the planet? How do we have them for future generations? I love that you're from Stradbroke Island. I'm from Tassie, so I had both the wonderful growing up of, both on the coast in Tassie and having the marine environment surrounding me, but also the forests inland. So I have probably those two worlds collide. And I can constantly look at, our options and, from the forest stewardship point of view and the MSc and ASC, we have systems in place that allows us to have our resources for the future. And that's probably, my commitment to the work that I'm doing. And with the MSc and the ASC, we also form what we call the Trusted Labels Group, which is a group of like-minded organisations that play in this space of certification and actually have a label that has the strength and integrity behind it. So, that's my quick introduction of why I'm here today. And thank you for allowing us to be here with the forests as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Very proud to be here too. My name is Heidi Walker from Walker Seafoods and Walker Tuna. I don't come from a fishing background either. My husband decided to become a tuna fisherman in 2001, much to my horror. So we both had corporate backgrounds in Sydney until he decided that life was too boring and let's make it really interesting. So I was very passionate. I was still in corporate and then decided to join him because I wanted to have a family in the business. We were growing our business from one boat. We grew it to 5 boats to become Australia's largest wild-caught tuna company. I was sick of having arguments with people about how sustainable our fishery was, the Eastern Tuna Billfish Fishery, which is a Commonwealth fishery run by AFMA, Australian Fisheries Management Authority. So I used to talk to chefs and people say, oh, my husband's a fisherman and you should use his tuna, and oh no, tuna's not sustainable and swordfish is not sustainable. I thought, well, what can I do about this? And that's when I instigated MSc for our fishery. People laughed at me. No one wanted to get on board with me, and I thought, well, that's okay. I'll just pay for it myself and get the certification just for Walker Seafoods, which we did, and we were the first in the Southern Hemisphere to get MSc certification because I believe sustainability is so important in fisheries around the world, and Australia does a very good job of managing its fisheries, but you do need something to prove that more than just telling somebody that we are a sustainable fishery, and hence why we got MSc. And now we've released a new range into Woolworths and Harris Farm and IGA called Walker's Tuna, please look out for it, which is also MSc certified because I believe Australians deserve to eat a really high quality product that's Australian in the tuna aisle of supermarkets, which at the moment you cannot find unless you buy our product.
Fantastic. Just extraordinary. I hope for those of us who are not yet convinced that there's a tie between fish forests and finance, just with that introduction, you saw that thread linking through. Let's dive straight into it with a question for you, Darian. And you've been in sustainable finance in the recent year. I've seen you travel, to different continents, having this discussion with stakeholders within that space. This question is, what do you think is the role of third-party certification schemes like the Marine Stewardship Council in being considered or integrated into financial risk assessment models, all, I guess, with the idea of how do we increase investor confidence, how do we propagate more capital flow into sustainable fisheries projects? How do you see that happening within those discussions that you're already having?
So I think one thing to think about the finance industry is that it's very data-led. You can tell them as many nice stories about how cute and fluffy it is, and this is really good for the fish, or this is really good for the octopi, whatever you want to speak about. But unless they have the data to back it up, they do not care about the stories. So I'll give you an analogy from when I worked with Thai Union. So a few years previously, we had set the largest global commitment to moving towards MSC certification for the fisheries that we were certifying. I did that in my role because we needed to have the fish. You can't run a business long term if you can't access the fish. But then when it came to getting a sustainability-linked loan several years ago, the finance sector, in this particular case is the banking industry, they're like, well, prove to us that you're being sustainable and give us a measurement that you can show year on year is having traction. And actually to get sustainability-linked finance, you have to have what's called a sustainability performance target. And again, they're not giving you a discount on your rate of interest out of the goodness of their hearts. They need to minimize their risk, maximize the upside. And so actually one of our sustainability performance targets was MSC certification and the increase of MSC certification, in particular in tuna fisheries that we were sourcing from. And so there is a strong link between certification as opposed to perhaps more on the greenwashing scale of just saying, well, we have sustainable seafood. And then looking at how financial institutions, and although I gave the example of banks, there's also investors, there's insurers, the whole range of financial institutions who want tangible, science-based data on which they can base their assessments and then manage their risks, and as I said, manage their upsides as well. And so that's where the MSC and the ASC do play a very important role.
Thank you for that. I mean, there's a link to what I'm going to ask you, Kiarne, about next, about the role of businesses as well. And I've seen you also very engaged within that space of trying to mobilize businesses to make their claims in a way that's credible. Not to discourage them, but really to mobilize, I think would be the right word to use. Really, at the end of the day, I think it's important that organizations tell the story, but it's how they tell the story and what they say is important. We are hearing from global research, though, that consumers are really keen to play their role. They're sometimes feeling helpless, they're feeling confused, but they're really very eager to play a part in trying to make the right consumer choices when they're out shopping. And oftentimes when we speak to businesses, we hear them telling us this, not you out there, because the businesses here have put their best foot forward, and it's not you I'm talking about, but often we hear businesses say, you know, why should we be putting our best foot forward in terms of committing to sustainability when our consumer research is showing label awareness is very low? You know, none of them are coming into our shops and asking or demanding for it. I'd be keen to know what is your response? How would you respond to that sort of statements?
I think both things are true. The first statement was, there's research saying that consumers are wanting to play their role, they want to consume better, when they go shopping, they do hope to purchase better. That's absolutely true. There's enough data that tells us that. You talk to anybody, if you had a choice, could you buy something? If you had a choice to buy a more sustainable product, would you? Of course. The other side of that is there is an enormous amount of confusion, lack of understanding, a fear of greenwashing, which is probably the more dangerous part of greenwashing, is the fear that something is greenwashing, more so than that it actually is, because people start to pull away from green claims because they're afraid of them. But really, there is, first and foremost, that people will buy the colour, the flavour, the quality or the price that suits them. If they can get all of those things and have a sustainable solution, awesome. But they don't know how to. No, there is so much confusion, and the accusations of greenwashing is having businesses go, I'm afraid to say it, I don't know what I can or when I should say it, and it's just making it almost impossible. I dedicate my life to this work, and I walk into a supermarket and I try to make a good choice, and there are about 3 or 4 things that are easy. MSC and ASC labels are one of those things, but in most cases, even I have no idea how to make the most sustainable choice when I am shopping every day. It's hard.
That's completely, again, intertwined. I love the fact that all what you're saying is all connected from one to another, but that exactly what you're saying, Kiarne, is my, I guess, next question for you, Melanie. As you mentioned, we've pioneered the Trusted Labels Group from 2018, which comprises FSC, ASC, MSC, the Global Environment Choice Australia, GECA, and Australian Organics, and Fairtrade as well. So in Australia, it's been reported that there's 57 different ecolabels. So there's a hell of a lot, leading to what you were saying as well, Kiarne, in terms of just the confusion in terms of options out there. Now, what is your advice to consumers, I guess, who are shopping and trying to make a discerning call between what's credible, what's greenwashing, what's straddling between that two? And again, your advice for businesses in trying to make a positive uptake of this eco-label. So it's a consumer question there, and there's one for the businesses as well.
Oh, gosh. And I mean, that's incredibly challenging. Even as myself, as a relatively informed consumer, I think, going back to Kiarne, it is really difficult. And I don't necessarily think the consumer needs to play that role. I think, government need to step up. We've now had the inquiry into greenwashing and we're still awaiting the outcomes of that. So I think it is really important that, 57 labels across products now, if anyone knows what they mean, I have enough trouble explaining to my husband what the Forest Stewardship Council stands for. That's challenging and those choices. But in saying that, we know that people want to make the right choices. Some independent work that FFC's undertaken globally is that 46% of people globally recognise the FFC label and trust it. But what's really quite important there is those figures rise in the 18 to 24-year-old quite significantly. And so there is an increasing demand that's coming. It's a little bit behind where we are now as someone like myself of middle age, making those consumer choices. But they're coming thick and fast and we need to be prepared for it. What comes with a third-party certification label such as FFC or ASC or MSC becomes incredible accountability to the system. We are extremely complex systems, and I get challenged by many of our partners and our certificate holders of how complex we are. But with that becomes a level of integrity behind the label, something that we can actually back up and verify should we be challenged on it. And there are times where we are challenged on the integrity of our label, and we can stand by it, going back to the previous points, with really rigorous scientific data. And we're delighted in FFC to have an incredible study that's come out of Gabon recently of saying FFC certified forests actually have greater values of biodiversity, including those greater mammal species, which are obviously of our most endangered on the planet. And I'm sure MSC and ASC have similar data of the real impact of what they actually do within the marine environment. Within certified systems, there's a level of independence. We are, as MSC and ASC, are this, we're essentially the standard setting body, and I should have the most boring job in the world as a standard setting body, but I probably think I've got one of the best roles in Australia. We also have in our system supply chain assurance. So it's not just that end product that you see sitting on a supermarket shelf. If I talk FFC, it's from the forest floor right through every link of that chain that we know is not broken. Put into that FFC, in the FFC world, issues such as modern slavery, some of those social issues as well. So there's a tremendous amount that sits behind that third-party certification system. As I said, that is where we are complex, we have independence, we have accountability, we have supply chain assurance, and we have tremendous rigour. And one of the other points, I think, on that is we don't allow bad actors into the systems either. So you can't be company A, but I'm just not quite sure what we're doing over here, and we'll excise that little bit off and we'll form company B, and they're the really good actor in the system. If those two companies are linked, they're no-go in the system. So it's a complete cultural change on the way in which we do business. And I think the businesses that we do work with under these trusted labels understand that it's a whole business requirement or cultural shift in what they're doing, and it's exactly what our consumers are wanting right now, and it's exactly what our consumers will demand in the future in much greater ways.
That's such a good point, isn't it, Melanie, at the end, that you're saying while the labels themselves look pretty simple, And they look simple because obviously we want consumers to be able to identify them when they're shopping or when they're eating in a restaurant or having a conversation with the community. The process that they've gone through is far from simple. It's rigorous, it's complex, right? It's a thorough process. So that in itself is interesting. Now, ultimately, all the conversations we've had here about mobilizing sustainable finance, encouraging businesses to be able to talk about their environmental credentials, the complexity of the certification process that it entails, ultimately stems from, obviously, in the context of the MSC, best fisheries practice, management practice, and what they're doing within the fisheries front. So no pressure, Heidi. But, you, as part of Walker Seafoods, were the first tuna fishery in the country to be MSC certified, I think, back in 2015, so about 10 years ago. Incredible feat, that is. And since then, you've been a leading Australian entrepreneur. You're one of the top seafood exporters from Australia around the world as well. In the last decade, what do you think are the shifts that you've observed, both in terms of the consumer space as well as in terms of business, not just in Australia, but around the world, that you feel like, whoa, this has really shifted or changed within that period of time?
I mean, it's on the same narrative here around sustainability and that people want to purchase something that is sustainable, especially in the tuna aisle of supermarkets. That is a big thing, and there's a lot of research behind that. And I've really noticed that in the last 10 years, especially exporting to the US, which is one of our primary markets. And the greenwashing, and I do sort of love and hate that word at the same time, is challenging in the tuna aisle because there are a lot of brands using words like dolphin friendly and sustainably caught with no scientific backing to that. The one that I hate the most, and everyone's going to know which brand this is, I won't name the brand, is the pole and line. Oh, it's pole and line caught. Now, pole and line caught does not make something sustainable. It is not how you catch the fish, it's the fishery itself. We all know that, but the consumer doesn't know that, and I really hate seeing that. And that's why we have MSC. In the US, big companies are being taken to task. Consumers are saying, no, I don't want this. I want to know if it is sustainable. There's a class action against Costco and Aldi currently happening, and that is because they put labels on tuna cans saying things like sustainably sourced with no credentials, no backing, no scientific background behind that. And that is really interesting to see that consumers have stepped up and said, no, if you say that, I want you to prove that to me. We're seeing more of that in Australia. We are seeing people saying, what does that actually mean? You're putting a picture of a dolphin on your label. What does that actually mean? So it's really good to see people voicing their opinion, saying to the big supermarkets, hey, you need to actually walk the walk and not talk the talk. And I'm really pleased to see that. And it's a good thing for MSC because it allows them to stand up and say, this is why you need a certification like ours.
Such a positive and successful case study. Thank you for that. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move into our last question, which is, and it's going to be kind of like a rapid fire. So just a bit more visionary, a bit more high level, but just tapping into your expertise, I guess, in terms of, and we all want to do so much, given the, the limited human bandwidth that we have. But, if you were given all the resources in the world, in whatever that means, and whatever that would take, and you've got 12 months to make those radical changes, what do you think, as an individual, you'd be trying to push the envelope on your individual respective fields? Kiarne, that's a big one.
Any money, 12 months. Okay, I would say wild capture seafood is the only completely wild species that we consume commercially. Everything else has been domesticated. But when I went into working in finance, people were just like, we're just working on climate change. That makes no sense whatsoever. There is no delineation in nature between climate change, nature, biodiversity, and then people. And so I would actually start to get people to think about this whole system. We are part of the ecosystem as humans, as well as the species, as well as climate change, and think of solutions from that holistic perspective.
Beautiful.
If I had all the money in the world, I would hire all the scientists in the world and conduct a life cycle assessment on every single product that a consumer can buy and score it against 17 goals and make that information available to every consumer on Earth. That's what I would do.
Go for it.
Wow. I think I'd be probably heading back to basics, and that is going back to education of our future generations, and that is, you know, putting them in those environments that you know I was so lucky to grow up in, and ensuring that got connection to both their land and waters. I think, and including that Indigenous knowledge into our education system for the protection of those resources for future generations. And I'm an absolute advocate that that you know we can have our forests and we can have our marine environments and we can use the resources from an economic perspective, from a social perspective to increase the rights of communities for sovereignty around the world, and also, you know, meet our environmental challenges as well. So it's just better use of our resources, but the education of those future generations coming forward.
All the money in the world. I would shut down fishing in the high seas. I'm very passionate about that. I don't think we should be allowing fishing in the high seas. It's damaging to fisheries within countries' EEZ, even our fishery, because there is no fence out in the ocean where the fish stop. So when we have Chinese, Spanish vessels out there doing whatever they please and transshipping and IUU fishing, that is impacting other fisheries that are doing the right thing. You know, we're Australian flag vessels. We are not allowed to go into the high seas and do what we please. However, we do have countries that fund and allow that, and I think we really need to look at that as a community as why it's still allowed.
Thank you very much. I guess as a moderator, I know it's always easier to sit here and ask all those tough questions. It's my payback moment, really. But I'm hoping that you will ask me all the tough questions when we come and meet with you. I've got the entire team that I'll make an introduction for you later. But more importantly, a huge round of applause for our fantastic panel speakers. Thank you.